The call came at 2:47 a.m., and I knew before I even answered that something was terribly wrong. Ashley's voice was barely a whisper, broken and shaking in a way that made my chest tighten with panic. "Kimberly," she said, and I could hear the wind howling in the background. "I'm outside. They won't let me in." My heart stopped. Outside? In Philadelphia? In the middle of November, with temperatures dropping below freezing? I sat up in my bed, my mind racing as I tried to process what she was telling me. "What do you mean outside? Where are you exactly?" "I'm at Mom's house," Ashley whispered, and I could hear her teeth chattering through the phone. "I came to visit like we planned, but Donald said there's no room for me. He gave me a blanket and told me to sleep on the porch." The rage that surged through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone, my vision blurring with tears of fury. How dare he? How dare that man treat my sister like she was some kind of stray animal? Ashley was family. She was blood. She was everything to me, and the thought of her shivering outside while that monster slept comfortably in our childhood home made me want to scream. I could hear Ashley trying to muffle her sobs, probably not wanting to wake the neighbors or cause more trouble than she thought she already had. But this wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault, and I needed her to know that. "Ashley, listen to me," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "This is not okay. This is not normal. You are not the problem here." I was already throwing on clothes, grabbing my keys, my mind working frantically to figure out how to fix this nightmare. The drive from my apartment to Mom's house was only 20 minutes, but every second felt like an eternity knowing my sister was out there in the cold. "I don't understand why he hates me so much," Ashley continued, her voice breaking completely now. "I've tried everything, Kimberly. I've been polite. I've stayed out of his way. I've never caused problems when I visit. But it's like no matter what I do, it's never enough for him." My heart was shattering with every word she spoke. Ashley had always been the gentle one, the peacekeeper, the one who bent over backwards to make everyone else comfortable. She didn't deserve this cruelty, this systematic rejection from the man who was supposed to be a father figure to both of us. The fact that our mother was allowing this to happen made me sick to my stomach. As I drove through the empty streets of Philadelphia, my mind kept replaying every family gathering, every holiday, every moment I'd witnessed Donald's subtle but consistent coldness toward Ashley. I'd always told myself I was imagining things, that maybe he was just awkward or didn't know how to connect with her. But now, with Ashley literally locked out in the freezing cold, I couldn't deny the truth anymore. This wasn't awkwardness or misunderstanding. This was deliberate cruelty. This was a grown man systematically destroying my sister's sense of worth and belonging, and I'd been too blind or too cowardly to see it clearly before tonight. When I pulled up to the house, I could see Ashley huddled on the porch swing, wrapped in what looked like a thin throw blanket that wouldn't keep a cat warm. The sight of her there, small and shivering and abandoned, ignited something primal in me. I ran to her, wrapping her in my coat, feeling how cold her skin was through her clothes. "I'm getting you out of here," I whispered fiercely, helping her to her feet, "and I'm going to make sure this never happens again." The determination in my voice surprised even me, but I meant every word. Something fundamental had shifted in me tonight, and there was no going back. As I helped Ashley into my car, turning the heat up as high as it would go, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let this slide, wasn't going to pretend this was just a misunderstanding or a one-time thing. Donald had crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed, and if my mother wasn't going to protect Ashley, then I would. I looked at my sister, still shaking from the cold and the trauma of rejection, and I made her a promise that I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. "He's never going to hurt you like this again, Ashley. I swear to you, this ends tonight." The drive back to my apartment was silent, except for the sound of Ashley's gradually slowing breathing as she warmed up, but my mind was anything but quiet. I was already planning, already strategizing, already preparing for the war I was about to wage. Donald thought he could treat my sister like garbage and face no consequences? He thought he could manipulate our family dynamic and maintain his comfortable position of power while systematically destroying Ashley's place in our lives? He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I had the spare key to the house, the one Mom had given me years ago for emergencies, and tomorrow I was going to use it to change everything. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Ashley was still sleeping on my couch, exhausted from the emotional and physical trauma of the night before, and I wasn't about to leave her alone while I figured out my next move. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the spare key to Mom's house and thinking about everything that had led us to this moment. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time Donald's cruelty had been so blatant that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started making a mental list of all the times Ashley had been excluded, overlooked, or made to feel unwelcome in what should have been her own family home. The Christmas when Donald forgot to buy her a gift but had presents for everyone else. The birthday dinners where somehow there was never enough food when Ashley was there. The family photos where she was consistently positioned on the edge or cut out entirely. How had I missed the pattern? How had I been so blind to the systematic way he'd been erasing my sister from our family narrative? The guilt was eating me alive, but I channeled it into determination. When Ashley finally woke up around noon, she looked small and lost, like a child who'd been abandoned. She tried to smile when she saw me, but I could see the pain behind her eyes, the deep hurt that went far beyond just one night of sleeping outside. "How are you feeling?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She was broken, and it wasn't just from the cold. "I keep thinking I should call Mom and apologize," she said quietly, and my heart broke all over again. Apologize? For what? For existing? For having the audacity to expect basic human decency from her own family? "Ashley, you have nothing to apologize for," I said firmly, sitting down beside her on the couch. "What happened last night was abuse, pure and simple, and I'm not going to let it continue." She looked at me with surprise, as if the idea that she didn't deserve this treatment was a foreign concept. That's when I realized just how deeply Donald's manipulation had affected her over the years. He'd convinced her that she was the problem, that she was somehow less deserving of love and acceptance than the rest of us. The psychological damage he'd inflicted was probably worse than the physical discomfort of sleeping outside. I spent the afternoon researching tenant rights and family law, trying to understand what legal options we might have. But the more I read, the more I realized that the law couldn't fix what was fundamentally a moral problem. Donald wasn't technically doing anything illegal by refusing to let Ashley stay in a house that belonged to him and our mother. But just because something was legal didn't make it right, and I wasn't going to let technicalities stop me from protecting my sister. Sometimes you have to create your own justice when the system fails you. That evening, I made my decision. I was going to change the locks on the house while Donald was at work the next day. It was bold, it was risky, and it would definitely cause a massive family explosion, but I didn't care anymore. Ashley deserved a place where she felt safe and welcome, and if our mother wasn't going to provide that, then I would. I called a locksmith and scheduled an appointment for the next afternoon, my hands shaking as I gave them the address. There was no turning back now, and honestly, I didn't want to turn back. I was done being complicit in Ashley's suffering. As I tucked Ashley into the guest bed that night, she grabbed my hand and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for believing me," she whispered. "Sometimes I thought I was going crazy, like maybe I really was the problem." The fact that she'd been gaslit so thoroughly that she questioned her own reality made me even more determined to follow through with my plan. Donald had spent years making Ashley feel like she was worthless, like she didn't belong anywhere, like she was lucky to receive even the smallest scraps of affection or acceptance. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect the person I loved most in this world. I lay awake most of that night, thinking about the conversation I would have to have with Mom, the confrontation with Donald that was inevitable, the possibility that I might be destroying our family in order to save it. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the image of Ashley shivering on that porch, abandoned and alone, and my resolve strengthened. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, and my sister's dignity and well-being were definitely on that list. Tomorrow, I was going to change more than just the locks. I was going to change the entire power dynamic that had allowed this abuse to continue for so long. The locksmith arrived at exactly 2 p.m., just as I'd planned. Donald would be at work until at least 6, and Mom was at her book club meeting, which meant I had a solid window of opportunity to execute my plan without interference. My hands were trembling as I let the locksmith into the house, the same house where Ashley and I had grown up, where we'd played in the backyard and had sleepovers in the living room and felt safe and loved before Donald came into our lives. Walking through those familiar rooms now felt like entering a crime scene, knowing what had happened here just 2 nights ago. "You sure about this, miss?" the locksmith asked as he examined the front door. He was an older man with kind eyes, and I could tell he sensed the tension in the situation, even though I'd tried to act casual when I called. "This is my family's house," I said, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "I have every right to be here." But even as I said the words, I wondered if I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Was I becoming the kind of person who took justice into their own hands? Was I any better than Donald if I was willing to manipulate and scheme to get what I wanted? The sound of the drill echoing through the house felt like a declaration of war. With each turn of the screw, I was making a statement that I wouldn't tolerate Ashley's mistreatment anymore, that there would be consequences for cruelty, that our family's dysfunction stopped here and now. But I was also terrified of what would happen when Donald came home and found himself locked out of his own house. He had a temper that I'd seen glimpses of over the years, usually directed at Ashley in subtle ways. But I'd never been the direct target of his rage before. Tonight, that was going to change. As the locksmith worked, I found myself wandering through the house, looking at family photos that told a carefully curated story of happiness and togetherness. But now I could see what I'd missed before. How Ashley gradually disappeared from the pictures after Donald moved in. How her smile became more forced and brittle in the few photos where she did appear. How she was always positioned slightly apart from the rest of us, as if she didn't quite belong. The evidence of his systematic exclusion of her was everywhere once I knew what to look for, and I felt sick that I'd been so blind to it for so long. I called Ashley from the house phone, my voice shaking with a mixture of excitement and terror. "It's done," I told her. "The locks are changed. You can come home now." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought we'd been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Are you sure about this, Kimberly? He's going to be so angry. What if he calls the police? What if Mom takes his side?" All valid concerns, all possibilities I'd considered, but none of them mattered more than Ashley's right to feel safe and welcome in her own family home. "Let him call the police," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "Let him explain to them why he thinks it's acceptable to force his stepdaughter to sleep outside in freezing weather. Let him try to justify his years of emotional abuse to people who actually understand what family is supposed to look like." I was done being afraid of Donald's reactions, done tiptoeing around his fragile ego, done pretending that keeping the peace was more important than protecting Ashley. If he wanted a war, he could have one, but he was going to discover that I was a much more formidable opponent than he'd anticipated. When Ashley arrived at the house an hour later, she stood on the front porch for a long moment, staring at the new locks as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. I opened the door and pulled her inside, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her eyes that I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. "This is your home," I told her firmly, leading her to the living room where we'd spent countless hours as children. "You belong here. You've always belonged here. And no one is ever going to make you feel otherwise again." She started crying then, but they were different tears than the ones she'd shed 2 nights ago. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of finally feeling like someone was fighting for her. We spent the afternoon together in the house, cooking dinner and talking about memories from our childhood before Donald had poisoned the atmosphere with his resentment and manipulation. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from us, like taking back the sanctuary that every child deserves to have. But as the sun started to set and 6 o'clock approached, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. Donald would be home soon, and when he discovered that he couldn't get into his own house, when he realized that I'd essentially staged a coup against his authority, there was going to be hell to pay. I just had to hope that I was strong enough to weather the storm that was coming. The sound of Donald's car pulling into the driveway at 6:23 p.m. made my stomach drop, but I forced myself to stay calm. Ashley and I were sitting in the living room, and I could see her entire body tense up at the familiar sound of his engine. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, reaching over to squeeze her hand, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed my own words. Through the window, I watched him walk up to the front door with his usual confident stride, completely unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. The moment he tried his key, and it didn't work, his whole demeanor changed. The pounding on the door started immediately, followed by Donald's voice, louder and more aggressive than I'd ever heard it before. "What the hell is going on? Open this door right now!" His fist hammered against the wood with increasing violence, and I could hear him trying his key over and over again, as if sheer force of will could make it work. Ashley was shaking beside me, her face pale with terror, and I realized that this was probably how she'd felt every day living under his roof, walking on eggshells, never knowing when his anger would explode. But today, for the first time, there was a barrier between her and his rage. "Kimberly, I know you're in there," he shouted, and I could hear him walking around the house, trying windows, looking for another way in. "This is my house. You can't lock me out of my own house." But that was exactly what I'd done, and with each passing minute, I felt more certain that it had been the right decision. The man who was screaming and threatening outside was the same man who had calmly told my sister to sleep on the porch in freezing weather. This was who he really was when his control was threatened, when someone finally stood up to his bullying tactics. I finally walked to the front door, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "Donald, I need you to calm down," I called through the door. "We need to have a conversation about how Ashley has been treated in this family, and I'm not opening this door until you're ready to have that conversation like a civilized human being." The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the shouting had been. I could practically feel his rage radiating through the door, could imagine the calculations going on in his head as he tried to figure out how to regain control of the situation. "You have no right to do this," he said finally, his voice lower, but no less menacing. "This is between me and Ashley. You don't understand the situation." But that was exactly the problem. I was finally starting to understand the situation all too clearly. I was beginning to see the pattern of manipulation, the way he'd isolated Ashley from the rest of the family, the way he'd convinced everyone, including me, that she was somehow the problem. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I understand that you've been systematically abusing my sister for years, and I'm not going to let it continue." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Through that locked door, Donald revealed himself in ways I'd never seen before. He tried every manipulation tactic in the book: gaslighting, guilt-tripping, threatening, bargaining. He claimed Ashley was mentally unstable, that she'd always been a problem child, that I was being manipulated by her lies and exaggerations. But with each word he spoke, he only confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. This wasn't about Ashley's behavior or personality. This was about a man who couldn't tolerate the existence of someone he couldn't completely control. When Mom's car pulled into the driveway an hour later, I knew the real test was about to begin. Donald immediately ran to her, and I could hear him through the window, spinning his version of events, painting himself as the victim of my irrational behavior. I watched my mother's face through the glass, saw the confusion and distress as she tried to process what was happening. This was the moment of truth. Would she stand by the man she'd married, or would she finally see what he'd been doing to her daughter? The next few minutes would determine not just the future of our family, but whether Ashley would ever truly have a home again. As Mom approached the front door, I could see the conflict written all over her face. She looked older somehow, worn down by years of trying to keep everyone happy, of pretending that the tension in our family was normal. "Kimberly, honey, what's going on?" she called through the door, her voice tired and confused. "Donald says you've changed the locks. Why would you do something like that?" And in that moment, I realized that the hardest part wasn't going to be confronting Donald. It was going to be helping my mother see the truth about the man she'd chosen over her own daughter's well-being. Opening that door to face my mother was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I knew it was necessary for Ashley's healing and our family's future. Mom stood there looking fragile and confused, caught between the man she'd married and the daughter she'd failed to protect. and I could see in her eyes that deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Mom, I need you to listen to me," I said gently, taking her hands in mine. "Ashley was forced to sleep outside 2 nights ago because Donald wouldn't let her in the house. She called me at 3 a.m., shivering and crying, and I found her on the porch with nothing but a thin blanket." I watched as the color drained from her face, as the reality of what I was telling her began to sink in. "I changed the locks because I refuse to let anyone treat my sister like she's disposable. And if you're honest with yourself, you know this isn't the first time he's been cruel to her." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, as years of suppressed truth finally came pouring out. Mom broke down crying as she admitted that she'd noticed Donald's coldness toward Ashley, but had convinced herself it was just an adjustment period, that things would get better with time. "I was so afraid of being alone again," she whispered, her voice breaking with shame and regret. "After your father died, I thought Donald was my second chance at happiness, and I was terrified that if I confronted him about Ashley, he would leave me too." Ashley, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke up, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. "Mom, I never wanted you to choose between us, but I needed you to protect me. I needed you to see that what he was doing wasn't okay." The 3 of us stood there in the doorway, finally having the conversation we should have had years ago, while Donald paced angrily in the yard, realizing that his control over our family was slipping away. In the weeks that followed, everything changed in ways I never could have anticipated. Mom asked Donald to move out temporarily while she figured out what she really wanted, and for the first time in years, Ashley felt safe coming home. We spent hours talking about the manipulation and gaslighting she'd endured, helping her understand that none of it had been her fault, that she deserved love and acceptance just as much as anyone else. Donald tried to fight the separation, alternating between rage and attempts at reconciliation. But Mom had finally seen him for who he really was, and there was no going back. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, filled with laughter and warmth that had been missing for so long. Ashley started therapy to work through the years of emotional abuse, and slowly but surely, I watched my sister reclaim her sense of self-worth and her place in our family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept the unacceptable, even when it means burning down everything you thought you knew about the people you love.